Do you know the fascinating story behind one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Plato? Welcome to the channel, where we dive deep into his life, ideas, and profound impact on Western thought. Join us as we explore his legacy, from the theory of forms to the founding of the Academy. Part 1. Early life in Athens. Plato, originally known as Aristocles, was born in 427 BCE in the powerful city-state of Athens. His birthplace was significant because Athens, at the time, was the intellectual and cultural heart of ancient Greece, a center of philosophy, arts, and politics. Athens was undergoing a period of great change during Plato's childhood, marked by the turmoil of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict between Athens and Sparta that would later shape his views on governance, war, and society. Plato's family was of aristocratic origin, deeply rooted in Athenian political life. His father, Ariston, claimed lineage from the ancient Athenian kings, while his mother, Pariction, was related to the great log of Asolon. This noble heritage meant that Plato was raised in a household that was not only wealthy, but also deeply connected to the political and cultural elite of Athens. Growing up in such an environment, Plato would have been exposed to debates about justice, governance, and the nature of power from a young age. These themes would later become central to his philosophical writings. In his youth, Plato was educated in the traditional manner of a young Athenian aristocrat. This meant studying poetry, music, gymnastics, and the arts. The Greeks believed that a well-rounded education fostered both the body and the soul. Plato, however, showed an early inclination towards intellectual pursuits, excelling in subjects like poetry and rhetoric. He is said to have been a promising playwright, with his early works consisting of tragedies. However, it wasn't until his encounter with the philosopher Socrates that Plato abandoned his aspirations in poetry and theatre, realizing that the pursuit of wisdom was his true calling. This shift in Plato's interests came at a pivotal moment in Athens' history, as the city was recovering from the devastating effects of the Peloponnesian War. The war had not only weakened Athens militarily and economically, but also morally and politically. The defeat of Athens at the hands of Sparta in 404 BCE led to the temporary establishment of a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. This regime, led by men such as Critias, who was actually Plato's relative, was notorious for its violent repression of political dissent. While Plato had familial connections to these leaders, he became increasingly disillusioned with the oligarchic excesses and bloodshed. These political upheavals left a lasting mark on his thinking, particularly on questions about the nature of power and the dangers of tyranny. The instability of Athens during Plato's early years also introduced him to the fickleness of popular democracy, which contributed to his lifelong skepticism of democratic rule. Plato witnessed firsthand how easily the Athenian masses could be swayed by demagogues, and how quickly the political fortunes of even the greatest city-state could decline. Socrates' role in Plato's intellectual awakening was critical, though it came slightly later in Plato's youth. The precise details of when Plato first encountered Socrates are unclear, but it's commonly accepted that he became a devoted follower of the older philosopher in his early 20s. Socrates, who never wrote anything himself, taught primarily through conversation. His method of relentless questioning, known as the Socratic method, challenged conventional wisdom and encouraged critical self-examination. Plato found in Socrates a mentor who exemplified the philosophical life. Socrates' way of thinking, which prioritized ethical inquiry over sophistic rhetoric, provided the intellectual grounding for Plato's later works. Plato's early experiences with Socrates came during a time of intense political and social strife in Athens. The Peloponnesian War had shattered many Athenians' faith in democracy, particularly after the city's humiliating defeat. In this climate of disillusionment, Socrates stood as a beacon of philosophical inquiry, encouraging his followers to question everything from moral values to the workings of the state. Plato, a young man of immense intellectual curiosity, absorbed these teachings with great enthusiasm. He was captivated not just by the content of Socrates' ideas, but by the process of philosophical dialogue itself. The experience of engaging in dialectical conversations with Socrates and other Athenians shaped Plato's view of philosophy as a method of seeking truth rather than merely accumulating knowledge. Despite his deep admiration for Socrates, Plato was aware of the dangers that philosophical questioning posed in a society as volatile as Athens. In 399 BCE, when Plato was about 28 years old, Socrates was put on trial for allegedly corrupting the youth of Athens and for impiety. The trial of Socrates was a turning point not only in Plato's personal life, but also in his philosophical development. Plato, who was present at the trial, saw how Athenian democracy could be manipulated to silence dissent and persecute those who dared to question prevailing norms. The execution of Socrates, who was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock, left Plato deeply embittered. It was this event that set Plato on a lifelong quest to understand the true nature of justice, knowledge, and the role of the philosopher in society. After the death of Socrates, Plato left Athens, disillusioned by the corrupt and unstable political climate. He began a period of travel and study, venturing to places such as Megara, Egypt, and Italy. These journeys allowed him to encounter different philosophical traditions and ideas, further enriching his understanding of the world. In Egypt, for instance, Plato is believed to have studied mathematics and astronomy, subjects that would become integral to his later philosophical work. In Italy, he came into contact with the followers of Pythagoras, whose belief in the immortality of the soul and the importance of numbers and geometry deeply influenced Plato's metaphysical thinking. The Pythagorean emphasis on abstract forms and the structure of reality resonated with Plato's emerging view of the world. This period of intellectual exploration was crucial for Plato, as it allowed him to synthesize various strands of philosophical thought into a coherent system that he would later develop into his own philosophical doctrines. By the time Plato returned to Athens in the early 380s BCE, he was ready to establish himself as a philosopher in his own right. He had absorbed the teachings of Socrates and the wisdom of other traditions, but he was also beginning to formulate his own ideas about the nature of reality, knowledge, and justice. This led him to found the Academy in 387 BCE, a place where students could come to study philosophy, mathematics, and science under his tutelage. The establishment of the Academy was one of Plato's greatest achievements. It became the first institution of higher learning in the Western world and served as a model for future universities. The Academy was not only a place for instruction, but also a community of scholars dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom. Plato's vision for the Academy was to create a space where philosophical inquiry could flourish, free from the constraints of political power and the pressures of everyday life. The Academy operated under the premise that philosophy was not just an intellectual exercise, but a way of life. Plato believed that true knowledge could only be achieved through rigorous philosophical reasoning, and that the role of the philosopher was to seek the truth and apply it to the betterment of society. The Academy became a training ground for future leaders, many of whom would go on to play important roles in the political and intellectual life of Greece. Among its most famous students was Aristotle, who would later challenge and expand upon Plato's ideas. Through his early life experiences, his aristocratic upbringing, his education in the arts, his encounter with Socrates, and his travels abroad, Plato developed a unique philosophical outlook that would shape his entire career. His disillusionment with Athenian democracy, combined with his exposure to different philosophical traditions, led him to question the nature of reality, ethics, and governance. This period of intellectual and personal growth culminated in the founding of the Academy and the beginning of Plato's systematic exploration of the fundamental questions of philosophy. Human experience. Through their dialogues, Plato learned that philosophy was not just an academic discipline, but a way of life. Socrates' constant questioning of authority, tradition, and even his own beliefs inspired Plato to develop a philosophy that sought to understand the nature of reality, knowledge, and ethics in a systematic way. One of the central themes of Socrates' philosophy, and one that Plato would later expand upon, was the idea of the examined life. Socrates famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. For Socrates, this meant that individuals must constantly reflect on their actions, beliefs, and values in order to live a good and just life. This focus on self-examination and ethical reflection would become a cornerstone of Plato's philosophy. Plato's works are filled with dialogues in which Socrates challenges his interlocutors to examine their own lives and question their assumptions about what is good and just. Plato's early experiences with Socrates also shaped his views on education and the role of the philosopher in society. For Socrates, education was not about imparting knowledge, but about awakening the mind to the pursuit of truth. He believed that true learning came from dialogue and self-reflection, rather than from rote memorization or the passive absorption of facts. Plato took this idea and developed it further in his own philosophy, particularly in his famous allegory of the cave. In this allegory, Plato depicts human beings as prisoners chained inside a dark cave, only able to see shadows on the wall cast by objects behind them. The prisoners mistake these shadows for reality, unaware of the true nature of the objects casting them. Only by breaking free from the chains and ascending out of the cave into the light of the sun can they perceive the true forms of reality. This allegory, which Plato would develop later in his life, was deeply influenced by Socrates' teachings. It symbolized the philosopher's journey from ignorance to enlightenment, a journey that Plato himself had begun under Socrates' guidance. The allegory also reflected Plato's belief that most people live in a state of ignorance, mistaking the superficial appearances of things for their true nature. It was the philosopher's task to lead others out of the cave and help them see the truth. This idea of the philosopher as a guide to enlightenment would become a central theme in Plato's work, particularly in his later writings on the role of the philosopher king. Socrates' trial and execution in 399 BCE was a devastating blow to Plato. Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and of impiety, charges that Plato knew to be false. The trial, which took place during a period of political instability, was a farce. The jury, composed of 500 Athenian citizens, convicted Socrates by a narrow margin. He was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. Plato was present at the trial and was deeply affected by the injustice of the proceedings. The death of Socrates marked the end of Plato's idealism about Athenian democracy and led him to question the very foundations of the political system he had once hoped to participate in. In the wake of Socrates' death, Plato left Athens, disillusioned and seeking a new direction. He spent the next several years traveling and studying, eventually returning to Athens to found the academy, where he would continue the work that Socrates had begun. The encounter with Socrates had changed Plato's life forever, setting him on the path to becoming one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Part 2. Encounter with Socrates. The encounter between Plato and Socrates was one of the most significant turning points in Plato's life. Though Plato came from a wealthy and politically connected family, his early intellectual pursuits were not originally directed toward philosophy. Instead, as was customary for young men of his status in Athens, he was trained in poetry, rhetoric, and possibly the art of statecraft. However, all of this changed when Plato crossed paths with Socrates, a man who was not born into wealth or power, but who wielded an intellectual force that would shape the course of Western philosophy. Socrates, known for his unorthodox approach to teaching, didn't fit into the traditional mold of Athenian intellectuals. He wandered the streets of Athens, engaging people from all walks of life in conversation, questioning their beliefs, and urging them to examine their own lives. What drew Plato to Socrates was his method of inquiry, which sought not just to impart knowledge, but to provoke thought. Socrates' method, now known as the Socratic method, was a form of dialogue that used questions to expose contradictions and weaknesses in the arguments of his interlocutors. Through this process, Socrates aimed to guide his students toward a deeper understanding of fundamental truths. Plato's relationship with Socrates was not simply one of a student absorbing the teachings of a master. It was an intellectual partnership in which Socrates' probing questions inspired Plato to think deeply about ethics, justice, and the nature of knowledge. Socrates did not write down his ideas, and much of what we know about his philosophy comes from Plato's dialogues. In these works, Socrates is often the central character, engaging with other Athenians in conversations about virtue, wisdom, and the nature of the good life. Through these dialogues, Plato not only preserved the teachings of Socrates, but also used the Socratic method to develop his own philosophical views. Socrates was unique in his approach to knowledge. Unlike the sophists, who were professional teachers of rhetoric and often charged fees for their services, Socrates did not claim to have knowledge to sell. In fact, he famously claimed that the only thing he knew was that he knew nothing. This paradoxical statement was not a form of humility, but a philosophical stance. Socrates believed that true wisdom came from recognizing the limits of one's knowledge and continually seeking to understand more. It was this relentless pursuit of knowledge that drew Plato to Socrates. Socrates' emphasis on questioning, rather than accepting conventional wisdom, aligned with Plato's growing sense of disillusionment with the political and social structures of Athens. At the time that Plato began following Socrates, Athens was a city in turmoil. The Peloponnesian War, which had raged for nearly 3 decades, had left Athens weakened both militarily and economically. The defeat of Athens by Sparta in 404 BCE had profound consequences for the city's political system. In the aftermath of the war, Athens experienced a brief but brutal oligarchic regime known as the rule of the 30 tyrants. During this period, a small group of wealthy Athenians seized control of the city and instituted a reign of terror, targeting political opponents and confiscating property. Although the 30 tyrants were eventually overthrown, their brief rule left a deep scar on the Athenian psyche and contributed to the growing cynicism about the viability of democracy. Plato was closely connected to the political turmoil of the time through his family. His uncle, Critias, was one of the leaders of the 30 tyrants, and his own relatives were involved in the oligarchic takeover. Despite these connections, Plato did not share the oligarchic sympathies of his relatives. Instead, he saw in the actions of the 30 tyrants the dangers of unchecked power and the moral corruption that could arise from political ambition. These experiences further solidified Plato's belief that the pursuit of power for its own sake, whether in the form of democracy or oligarchy, was fundamentally flawed. It was only through the pursuit of wisdom and the cultivation of virtue that a just society could be achieved. Socrates' influence on Plato during this period was profound. While many of Plato's contemporaries were preoccupied with political power and the practical concerns of governance, Socrates was focused on more abstract questions about the nature of justice, the good life, and the human soul. Socrates was not interested in political office or wealth. He lived modestly and spent his time questioning the moral foundations of Athenian society. For Plato, Socrates represented a new kind of intellectual hero, one who was more concerned with truth and virtue than with worldly success. The relationship between Plato and Socrates was not just one of teacher and student. It was a shared intellectual journey in which both men sought to understand the deeper truths that lay behind the surface of. Part 3. The Death of Socrates. The trial and subsequent death of Socrates was a pivotal moment in both Plato's personal and philosophical journey. The year was 399 BCE, and Athens, although recovering from the devastating aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, was still reeling from political instability, fear, and suspicion. Socrates, the unyielding and fearless philosopher who had spent his life questioning the norms of society, found himself at the mercy of a system that had grown intolerant of dissent. For Plato, who was a devoted follower of Socrates by this time, the events that unfolded during and after the trial would permanently shape his views on justice, politics, and the role of philosophy in society. Socrates had long been a controversial figure in Athens. He openly criticized the way things were done, from politics to religion, and had amassed both devoted followers and bitter enemies. His method of relentless questioning, aimed at exposing the ignorance of those who claimed to possess wisdom, did not sit well with many of the city's elites. To make matters worse, Socrates had become associated with figures like Alcibiades and Critias, who were seen as having contributed to the city's downfall during the Peloponnesian War. Alcibiades, a charismatic but unscrupulous politician, had defected to Sparta, Athens' greatest enemy, while Critias, a relative of Plato, was one of the notorious 30 tyrants who had ruled Athens with cruelty after its defeat by Sparta. These associations tarnished Socrates' reputation in the eyes of many Athenians, even though he himself had no direct involvement in the political actions of his infamous associates. Socrates' trial was ostensibly about two charges: corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety. The first charge was rooted in the idea that Socrates, through his teaching and questioning, was leading young Athenians astray from traditional values and encouraging them to think critically about authority and societal norms. The second charge, impiety, claimed that Socrates was disrespectful of the city's gods and was introducing new deities. These charges, while on the surface religious and moral in nature, were deeply political. The Athenian democracy, still fragile after years of war and upheaval, saw Socrates as a dangerous subversive figure who threatened the stability of the state. Plato was present at the trial, and through his writings, we gain insight into the proceedings and the atmosphere of the courtroom. In his dialogue Apology, Plato recounts Socrates' defense speech, in which Socrates not only refuses to grovel for mercy, but defiantly challenges the legitimacy of the charges brought against him. Socrates, true to his philosophical principles, argues that his life has been devoted to the pursuit of wisdom and that he has done no harm to the youth of Athens. He even suggests that if he has unintentionally corrupted anyone, they should step forward and testify against him. Instead of defending himself in a way that might have swayed the jury's favor, Socrates chooses to uphold his integrity and his commitment to philosophy. He asserts that a life without questioning, without the pursuit of truth, is not a life worth living. This statement, "The unexamined life is not worth living," became one of the most famous expressions of Socratic thought, a declaration of the philosopher's duty to seek knowledge and understanding, no matter the consequences. Despite his eloquent defense, Socrates was found guilty by a narrow margin. The Athenian judicial system allowed the convicted to propose an alternative punishment to the one suggested by the prosecution. The prosecutor demanded the death penalty, but Socrates, in a move that shocked the court, suggested that he should be rewarded for his service to the city by being given free meals for the rest of his life. This proposal was seen as an act of hubris, as Socrates knew that the jury was in no mood to grant such a favor. His second, more serious proposal was a fine of 30 minas, which was a substantial amount of money. However, the jury, angered by Socrates' refusal to show remorse or plead for clemency, sentenced him to death by an even larger margin than the initial guilty verdict. The method of execution was to drink a cup of hemlock, a poisonous plant. Socrates accepted his fate with remarkable calmness. Plato describes the final moments of Socrates' life in the dialogue Phaedo, where he portrays Socrates as a man at peace with his mortality. Surrounded by his friends and followers, Socrates used his last hours to engage in philosophical conversation about the immortality of the soul. In the dialogue, Socrates argues that death is not something to be feared because it is either a deep, dreamless sleep or a transition to another existence where the soul continues its pursuit of wisdom. This serene acceptance of death, along with Socrates' unwavering commitment to his principles, left an indelible mark on Plato and his fellow students. For Plato, the death of Socrates was more than the loss of a mentor and a friend. It was a profound moment of disillusionment with Athenian democracy. The very system that had once been celebrated for its openness and freedom of speech had turned against one of its most principled and critical voices. Plato came to see the execution of Socrates as an example of the inherent flaws in democratic governance. He believed that democracy, in its reliance on the whims and passions of the masses, was susceptible to manipulation and irrationality. The execution of Socrates demonstrated that the majority could easily be swayed by demagogues and could make decisions that were not based on reason or justice. This experience planted the seeds for Plato's later critique of democracy, which he would develop in works like the Republic, where he advocates for a government led by philosopher kings, rulers guided by wisdom, rather than by popular opinion. Plato's response to Socrates' death was not immediate. After the execution, he left Athens, disillusioned by the political climate and the injustice he had witnessed. He traveled to various parts of the Mediterranean, including Megara, where he met with other philosophers, and Egypt, where he is said to have studied mathematics and possibly some aspects of ancient Egyptian religion. These travels were not only an intellectual journey, but also a period of mourning and reflection for Plato. He sought to understand the broader implications of Socrates' death and to reconcile the philosopher's teachings with the harsh realities of political life. Socrates' death forced Plato to confront a fundamental question: how could a just man be condemned by a system that claimed to uphold justice? This question became a central theme in much of Plato's later work. In the Republic, for instance, Plato explores the nature of justice and the idea of the philosopher king, a ruler who, unlike the Athenian politicians, would be guided by wisdom and the pursuit of truth rather than by personal ambition or the demands of the people. The dialogue presents a vision of an ideal state where rulers are selected based on their intellectual and moral qualities, ensuring that justice prevails not through the whims of the majority, but through the careful application of reason and philosophical inquiry. Another important consequence of Socrates' death was Plato's growing interest in the nature of the soul and the afterlife. In dialogues like Phaedo and Phaedrus, Plato developed Socratic ideas about the immortality of the soul. Socrates had believed that the soul was the seat of knowledge and virtue, and that it survived the body after death. Plato took this idea further, arguing that the soul was immortal and that it existed before birth in a realm of pure knowledge, where it had direct access to the eternal forms, the perfect, unchanging realities that underlie the material world. This theory of the soul and the forms would become a cornerstone of Plato's metaphysics and would influence subsequent generations of philosophers, including his most famous student, Aristotle. The trial and death of Socrates also shaped Plato's views on education and the role of the philosopher in society. Socrates had spent his life teaching through dialogue, using questions to draw out knowledge from his students rather than simply imparting information. Plato saw the potential for education to transform individuals and society, but he also recognized the dangers that came with challenging established norms. He understood that true education that fosters critical thinking and the pursuit of truth, could be threatening to those in power. This tension between philosophy and politics would remain a central concern in Plato's work, as he sought to find a way to reconcile the philosopher's quest for knowledge with the practical demands of governing a city-state. Socrates' death was a defining moment not just for Plato, but for the entire history of Western philosophy. It signaled the end of one era of Athenian intellectual life and the beginning of another. For Plato, it was the catalyst that led him to develop a systematic philosophical approach that would seek to answer the questions that Socrates had raised but had left unresolved. How can justice be achieved in a society? What is the true nature of knowledge and virtue? What is the role of the philosopher in a world that often seems hostile to reason and truth? These were the questions that would occupy Plato for the rest of his life. Part 4. Plato's journey abroad. After the death of Socrates, Plato's immediate reaction was to leave Athens. The city that had put his beloved mentor on trial and condemned him to death was no longer a place where Plato felt he could live and pursue his philosophical goals. This period of travel would serve as both a physical and intellectual journey for Plato, allowing him to further refine his ideas and seek out new knowledge from other parts of the ancient world. Although exact details of Plato's travels are sparse, historical and anecdotal accounts suggest that he visited several key locations, each of which contributed to his philosophical development. His journey took him to places like Megara, Cyrene, Egypt, and southern Italy, exposing him to diverse cultures, philosophies, and ideas that would later be synthesized into his own unique system of thought. Plato's first stop after leaving Athens was Megara, where he sought refuge with Euclid, not the mathematician, but a fellow student of Socrates who had founded his own school of philosophy. The philosophers of Megara were known for their interest in Eleatic philosophy, particularly the teachings of Parmenides and Zeno, who argued that reality is unchanging and that all change and motion are illusions. These ideas likely influenced Plato's later development of his theory of forms, where he argued that the material world is a mere shadow of the true, unchanging reality of the forms. The Megarians focus on logical paradoxes and the nature of being further sharpened Plato's dialectical skills, which he had first honed under Socrates' tutelage. After spending some time in Megara, Plato embarked on a more extensive journey, traveling to Cyrene in North Africa. Cyrene was known for its intellectual and philosophical community, particularly in the field of mathematics. It is said that Plato studied under Theodorus of Cyrene, a renowned mathematician. This experience reinforced Plato's growing belief in the importance of mathematics as a tool for understanding the fundamental nature of reality. For Plato, mathematics represented a bridge between the material world and the abstract world of forms, as mathematical truths, unlike physical objects, are eternal and unchanging. This idea would later be central to his work, particularly in dialogues like the Republic, where he argued that the philosopher king must be trained in mathematics to grasp the higher realities of the forms. From Cyrene, Plato traveled to Egypt, one of the most ancient and advanced civilizations of the time. Egypt was known for its impressive achievements in architecture, science, religion, and mathematics, and it is believed that Plato spent some time studying the Egyptian priests, who were seen as guardians of both practical and esoteric knowledge. The Egyptians had a sophisticated understanding of geometry, which would have further deepened Plato's appreciation for the role of mathematics in understanding the cosmos. In addition to mathematics, Plato may have been influenced by Egyptian religious ideas, particularly the concept of an afterlife and the notion of the soul's immortality. Egyptian religion was deeply concerned with the journey of the soul after death, a theme that would become central to Plato's own philosophical musings about the immortality of the soul and the nature of human existence. Plato's time in Egypt may also have influenced his views on the role of the philosopher in society. The Egyptian priests were not only religious leaders but also scholars, astronomers, and healers, embodying a model of learned authority that Plato admired. He would later advocate for a similar role for philosophers in his ideal society, where philosopher kings would be both wise rulers and guardians of knowledge. Plato's vision of an enlightened ruling class, educated in mathematics, philosophy, and the arts, may have been shaped in part by his exposure to the Egyptian priesthood and their role in maintaining order and knowledge within their society. After leaving Egypt, Plato continued his journey, traveling to southern Italy, where he encountered the Pythagoreans, a sect of philosophers and mathematicians who followed the teachings of Pythagoras. The Pythagoreans believed that numbers and mathematical ratios were the underlying principles of the universe, and that reality could be understood through the study of mathematics and harmonics. They also believed in the transmigration of souls, the idea that the soul is immortal and undergoes a series of reincarnations, moving from one body to another in its quest for purification and wisdom. Plato was deeply influenced by these ideas, particularly the Pythagorean belief in the harmony of the cosmos and the immortality of the soul. The Pythagorean emphasis on the importance of numbers and mathematics as the foundation of reality reinforced Plato's own belief that the material world was a mere reflection of higher, abstract truths. The influence of Pythagorean thought on Plato can be seen most clearly in his dialogues, particularly in the Republic, where he develops his theory of forms. Plato argues that the material world is constantly changing and therefore cannot be the source of true knowledge. Instead, true knowledge comes from understanding the eternal and unchanging forms, which exist in a higher realm of reality. This idea is deeply Pythagorean in its emphasis on the distinction between the world of appearances and the world of eternal truths. Furthermore, the Pythagorean belief in the immortality of the soul and its purification through successive reincarnations would become central to Plato's own theories about the soul, particularly in works like the Phaedo and the Phaedrus. In addition to his encounters with the Pythagoreans, Plato's time in southern Italy brought him into contact with the city of Syracuse, a powerful Greek city-state ruled by a series of tyrants. Plato's interest in politics, particularly the question of how to create a just and stable society, led him to become involved with the ruling class of Syracuse. His experiences in Syracuse would later become one of the most significant and personally challenging periods of his life. Plato believed that the rulers of Syracuse could be educated in philosophy and transformed into philosopher kings, capable of governing the city wisely and justly. However, his attempts to influence the political situation in Syracuse would ultimately end in failure and personal disappointment. Plato's involvement with Syracuse began during his first visit to the city, where he became acquainted with Dion, the brother-in-law of the ruling tyrant Dionysius I. Dion, like Plato, was a student of philosophy and was deeply impressed by Plato's ideas. He believed that Plato's teachings could help reform the government of Syracuse and create a more just and enlightened society. Dion introduced Plato to Dionysius I, but the tyrant was more interested in consolidating his own power than in the pursuit of philosophical wisdom. Despite this initial setback, Plato would return to Syracuse years later, at the invitation of Dionysius II, the son of the former tyrant, in the hopes of finally realizing his vision of a philosopher king. Plato's experiences in Syracuse were marked by political intrigue, betrayal, and personal disappointment. While Dionysius II initially expressed interest in Plato's teachings, his commitment to philosophy was shallow, and he was more concerned with maintaining his own power and wealth. Plato's efforts to educate the young ruler in the principles of justice and wisdom were met with resistance, both from Dionysius himself and from the entrenched political interests in the city. Eventually, Dion was exiled, and Plato found himself a virtual prisoner in Syracuse, caught in the middle of the city's political struggles. He eventually managed to escape with his life, but the experience left him deeply disillusioned with the possibility of reforming tyrannical regimes through philosophy. Plato's journey abroad, particularly his experiences in Syracuse, reinforced his belief that true political reform could not be achieved without a fundamental transformation in the nature of governance. His failure to convert Dionysius II into a philosopher king highlighted the difficulty of applying philosophical principles to real-world politics. Plato came to realize that the pursuit of wisdom and justice could not be easily reconciled with the pursuit of power. This realization would inform much of his later work, particularly in the Republic, where he develops a more idealized vision of a just society, one that is governed not by tyrants or politicians, but by philosophers trained in the pursuit of truth and virtue. By the time Plato returned to Athens, likely in the early 380s BCE, he had been exposed to a wide range of ideas and experiences that would shape his mature philosophical system. His travels had deepened his understanding of mathematics, metaphysics, and politics, and he had come to realize that true knowledge could only be achieved through rigorous philosophical inquiry. It was upon his return to Athens that Plato founded the Academy, one of the first institutions of higher learning in the Western world, where he would teach his students and continue to develop his philosophical ideas for the rest of his life. Part 5. Founding the Academy. After years of travel, exploration, and contemplation, Plato returned to Athens around 387 BCE, ready to establish a permanent space where he could continue his philosophical inquiries and share his knowledge with others. Athens, despite the political instability it had experienced in the years following the Peloponnesian War, remained a center of learning and intellectual exchange. Plato saw the need for a structured place of learning that could serve as both a refuge for those committed to the pursuit of wisdom and as a center for the intellectual development of future leaders. It was in this spirit that he founded the Academy, named after the park, the Grove of Academos, where it was located just outside the city walls. The Academy would not only become one of the most important philosophical institutions in ancient Greece, but it would also set the foundation for higher education as we understand it today. The founding of the academy represented a significant departure from the traditional modes of education in Athens. In Plato's time, education was generally informal and conducted by individual tutors or in small groups. While there were some schools of thought, such as the Sophists, who taught rhetoric and practical skills for a fee, there was no formal institution dedicated solely to the pursuit of knowledge in a systematic way. The academy sought to change that by offering a place where philosophy, mathematics, science, and the arts could be studied collectively and comprehensively. Plato's vision was not just to educate individuals for personal enlightenment, but to train future leaders who could apply philosophical wisdom to the governance of the state. At the heart of Plato's academy was the belief that education should be more than just a means to acquire practical skills or knowledge for worldly success. Plato believed that true education was about cultivating the soul and preparing individuals for a life of virtue and contemplation. This idea was deeply influenced by the teachings of Socrates, who had insisted that wisdom and virtue were the most important goals in life. The academy thus became a place where students were encouraged to think critically, to question their assumptions, and to engage in deep philosophical inquiry. Unlike the Sophists, who were often criticized by Plato for teaching rhetoric as a way to win arguments rather than pursue truth, the academy placed a strong emphasis on dialectic, the method of dialogue and reasoning that Socrates had used to uncover deeper truths. Plato's curriculum at the academy was broad and included a range of subjects that reflected his belief in the interconnectedness of all forms of knowledge. Mathematics played a central role in the education at the academy, not just as a tool for solving practical problems, but as a way of understanding the underlying order of the universe. Plato had been deeply influenced by the Pythagoreans during his travels, and he shared their belief that numbers and mathematical relationships were the key to understanding both the physical world and the abstract realm of forms. The study of geometry, in particular, was seen as a way to train the mind to think abstractly and to prepare students for higher philosophical inquiry. It is said that above the entrance to the academy was inscribed the phrase, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter," reflecting the importance Plato placed on mathematics as a foundation for philosophical thought. In addition to mathematics, the academy offered instruction in astronomy, ethics, politics, and metaphysics. Plato believed that the study of the natural world could lead to a greater understanding of the forms, the perfect, eternal realities that existed beyond the physical world. For Plato, the material world was constantly changing and imperfect, but the forms, such as those of justice, beauty, and equality, were unchanging and could only be grasped through reason and intellectual contemplation. The academy, therefore, was not just a place to learn about the physical world, but a place to explore the deeper truths that lay beyond it. Plato's famous theory of forms would become one of the central doctrines taught at the academy, influencing generations of philosophers who came after him. Perhaps one of the most significant aspects of the academy was its open and collaborative nature. Unlike modern universities, where structured classes and rigid curricula dominate, the academy functioned more like a philosophical community where students and teachers engaged in ongoing dialogue and debate. There was no set program of study, and students were encouraged to pursue their own intellectual interests, guided by the principles of dialectic and philosophical inquiry. This open structure allowed for a dynamic exchange of ideas, with students often playing an active role in shaping the direction of their education. Plato himself was deeply involved in the daily life of the academy, often leading discussions and participating in debates with his students. One of the most famous students of the academy was Aristotle, who would later go on to become one of the greatest philosophers in history. Aristotle arrived at the academy around 367 BCE as a young man and studied under Plato for nearly 20 years. While Plato and Aristotle shared many philosophical interests, particularly in the areas of metaphysics and ethics, Aristotle would eventually come to challenge many of Plato's ideas, particularly his theory of forms. Aristotle believed that Plato's distinction between the physical world and the world of forms was too rigid, and that knowledge could be gained through empirical observation of the material world, rather than solely through abstract contemplation. Despite their differences, the intellectual partnership between Plato and Aristotle was one of the most significant in the history of Western philosophy, and it highlights the vibrant intellectual environment that the academy fostered. The academy was not just a school of philosophy, but also a center for scientific research. In addition to studying ethics and metaphysics, the students of the academy were engaged in the study of astronomy, biology, and other natural sciences. Plato himself had a keen interest in cosmology and the nature of the universe, as evidenced by his dialogue Timaeus, in which he presents a vision of the cosmos as an orderly and harmonious structure created by a divine craftsman, or demiurge. Plato believed that the study of the natural world could provide insights into the rational order that underpinned both the universe and human existence. This belief in the harmony of the cosmos and the importance of understanding the natural world was a key aspect of the Academy's curriculum. Although the Academy was primarily focused on philosophy and the sciences, it also played an important role in the political life of Athens. Plato believed that philosophers had a duty to apply their wisdom to the governance of the state, and many of his students went on to become prominent political leaders and advisors. Plato's own experiences in Syracuse, where he attempted to educate the young tyrant Dionysius II in philosophy, had shown him the difficulties of applying philosophical principles to real-world politics. However, he remained convinced that the ideal state could only be achieved if it was governed by philosopher kings, rulers who were trained in wisdom and virtue. The Academy thus became a training ground for future political leaders, many of whom would go on to influence the political landscape of Greece and beyond. One of the unique aspects of the Academy was its longevity. Unlike many other philosophical schools that were short-lived or limited to a single generation of students, the Academy continued to operate for nearly 900 years, long after Plato's death. It survived the political upheavals of the Hellenistic period, the rise of the Roman Empire, and even the decline of classical Greek culture. The Academy became a beacon of intellectual life in the ancient world, attracting students from all over Greece and beyond. It continued to influence philosophical thought for centuries, and its legacy can still be seen in modern universities and institutions of higher learning. Plato's vision for the Academy was deeply rooted in his belief that knowledge and wisdom were the highest pursuits of human life. He believed that the philosopher's task was not just to understand the world, but to improve it by applying reason and virtue to the challenges of human existence. The Academy was more than just a school. It was a community of thinkers dedicated to the pursuit of truth and the betterment of society. Through its rigorous emphasis on dialogue, critical thinking, and the integration of multiple disciplines, the Academy set the standard for what a higher education institution could be. The founding of the Academy marked the beginning of a new era in the history of philosophy and education. Plato's bold experiment in creating an intellectual community dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom and truth had a lasting impact on the development of Western thought. The Academy provided a model for future generations of scholars and educators, and its emphasis on dialectic, mathematics, and philosophical inquiry continues to influence modern educational practices. Through the Academy, Plato's ideas reached far beyond the confines of ancient Athens, shaping the intellectual landscape of the Western world for centuries to come. Plato's Academy was not just a place where students came to learn. It was a place where they came to think, to question, and to engage in the deepest and most fundamental inquiries about the nature of reality, justice, and human existence. It was a place where philosophy was not just a subject of study, but a way of life. Through the Academy, Plato left an enduring legacy, one that continues to inspire philosophers, educators, and thinkers to this day. Part 6. The Theory of Forms. The theory of forms is perhaps Plato's most profound and enduring contribution to philosophy. It represents the culmination of his quest to understand the nature of reality and knowledge, and it forms the bedrock of his metaphysical thought. Plato's theory is driven by a fundamental distinction between the physical world, which is ever-changing and imperfect, and a higher, non-material realm where perfect and unchanging forms, or ideas, exist. These forms, according to Plato, are the true essence of things, and the material world is merely a reflection or imitation of this higher reality. For Plato, the physical objects we perceive through our senses are not truly real in the deepest sense of the word. They are transient and flawed copies of these perfect forms, which can only be understood through reason and intellectual contemplation. The development of the theory of forms was influenced by several factors, including Plato's own experiences and the intellectual traditions he encountered throughout his life. The philosophical teachings of Parmenides and the Eleatics, whom Plato studied during his travels, played a significant role in shaping his ideas about permanence and change. Parmenides had argued that true reality must be eternal and unchanging, while the world of appearances is deceptive and illusory. This distinction resonated with Plato, who saw the sensory world as unstable and unreliable, a place where everything is in a constant state of flux. Plato's dissatisfaction with the physical world can also be traced back to his mentor, Socrates. Socrates had spent his life questioning the nature of virtue, justice, and goodness, but he had never fully articulated a metaphysical system to explain how these concepts could exist in a world that was so changeable and imperfect. Plato took up this challenge, and the theory of forms was his solution to the problem of how we can know universal truths in a world that is constantly changing. For Plato, the answer lay in the existence of a higher realm of reality, a realm where perfect, unchanging forms existed independently of the material world. The forms are the true reality in Plato's philosophy, and everything in the material world is a copy or representation of these forms. Take, for example, the concept of a circle. In the physical world, no perfectly round circle exists. All drawn circles, no matter how precise, have flaws or imperfections. But we can still conceive of a perfect circle in our minds, one that is perfectly symmetrical and adheres to the strict definitions of geometry. This mental conception, Plato argued, is not just an abstraction. It is a reflection of the form of the circle, an ideal and perfect version that exists in the realm of forms. Likewise, every physical object, whether a tree, a chair, or a horse, participates in its corresponding form. The form of the tree, for example, is the perfect essence of treeness, while individual trees in the material world are imperfect manifestations of this form. Plato believed that these forms were not only real, but that they were more real than the objects of the physical world. In his view, the material world is a world of appearances, where things come into being and pass away, but the forms are eternal, immutable, and perfect. Because the forms are the true reality, Plato argued that knowledge of them is the highest form of knowledge. This knowledge, however, cannot be attained through the senses, which only provide us with information about the changing and imperfect physical world. Instead, true knowledge must be gained through reason and intellectual reflection, as it is only through the mind that we can grasp the eternal truths of the forms. Plato developed this theory in several of his dialogues, most notably in the Republic, where he uses the famous allegory of the cave to illustrate the distinction between the world of appearances and the world of forms. In the allegory, human beings are depicted as prisoners chained inside a dark cave, unable to see anything except the shadows cast on the wall in front of them. These shadows represent the world of appearances, the fleeting, imperfect objects of the physical world. The prisoners mistake these shadows for reality because they have never seen anything else. However, one of the prisoners breaks free from the chains and escapes the cave. Outside, he is initially blinded by the sunlight, but as his eyes adjust, he sees the true reality for the first time: the sun, the trees, the sky, and the world in its fullness. This represents the journey of the philosopher, who, through reason and intellectual inquiry, moves beyond the world of appearances and comes to understand the higher reality of the forms. The allegory of the cave illustrates not only the distinction between the physical world and the realm of forms, but also the difficulty of attaining true knowledge. The philosopher, like the prisoner who escapes the cave, must undergo a painful and difficult process of enlightenment, moving from ignorance to knowledge. This process requires the philosopher to turn away from the distractions and illusions of the sensory world and focus, instead, on the eternal truths that lie beyond it. For Plato, this journey is not just an intellectual exercise. It is a moral and spiritual transformation, as the philosopher comes to understand the true nature of justice, virtue, and the good. In Plato's system, the form of the good occupies the highest position in the hierarchy of forms. Just as the sun in the allegory of the cave illuminates the world and makes vision possible, the form of the good illuminates the world of forms and makes knowledge possible. The form of the good is the source of all other forms, giving them their intelligibility and their being. In the Republic, Plato describes the form of the good as beyond being, suggesting that it transcends even the highest realities that can be known. For Plato, knowledge of the good is the ultimate goal of philosophy, as it allows the philosopher to understand not only the structure of reality, but also the moral principles that should guide human life. The ethical implications of the theory of forms are central to Plato's philosophy. Since the forms represent the perfect and unchanging essences of things, Plato believed that they provided a standard by which we could judge the moral and ethical qualities of our actions. For example, the form of justice is the perfect and eternal standard of justice, and all human attempts to achieve justice in the material world are judged according to how closely they approximate this ideal. In the same way, the form of beauty represents the perfect essence of beauty, and all beautiful things in the physical world are mere reflections of this higher reality. Plato believed that by understanding the forms, particularly the form of the good, human beings could live more virtuous and just lives, as they would be guided by a knowledge of what is truly real and important. Plato's theory of forms has been the subject of much debate and interpretation throughout the history of philosophy. Critics of the theory, including Plato's own student Aristotle, have argued that it creates an unnecessary division between the physical world and the world of forms. Aristotle believed that the forms did not exist independently of physical objects, but rather were embedded in the things themselves. According to Aristotle, knowledge could be gained through observation and analysis of the natural world, without the need for a separate realm of perfect forms. Despite these criticisms, Plato's theory of forms has had a lasting impact on Western philosophy, influencing thinkers from Plotinus and the Neoplatonists to modern philosophers like Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel. The theory of forms also laid the groundwork for Plato's views on education and the role of the philosopher in society. In the Republic, Plato argues that only those who have attained knowledge of the forms, particularly the form of the good, are fit to rule the state. He believed that philosophers, by virtue of their understanding of the true nature of reality, were uniquely qualified to lead society and make decisions that would promote justice and the common good. This idea of the philosopher king, who combines intellectual wisdom with moral virtue, is one of Plato's most famous and enduring political ideas. The influence of the theory of forms extends far beyond metaphysics and ethics. It also shaped Plato's views on art, aesthetics, and education. In his dialogue Ion, Plato critiques the role of poets and artists, arguing that they merely imitate the physical world, which is itself an imitation of the world of forms. As such, art is twice removed from reality, and it can lead people away from true knowledge by focusing on appearances rather than on the eternal truths of the forms. This critique of art and imitation would later influence philosophers like Kant, who also grappled with the relationship between art and truth. Plato's theory of forms remains one of the most influential and enduring ideas in the history of philosophy. It represents a bold and ambitious attempt to reconcile the changing, imperfect world we experience with the timeless and unchanging truths that philosophers seek to understand. Although the theory has been challenged and reinterpreted by later thinkers, its central insights continue to inspire debates about the nature of reality, knowledge, and the pursuit of wisdom. Through the theory of forms, Plato sought to answer some of the deepest and most enduring questions of human existence. What is real? How can we know the truth? And how can we live a good and just life? Part 7. The Allegory of the Cave. One of the most famous and enduring images from Plato's philosophy is the allegory of the cave, which he presents in the Republic. The allegory serves as a powerful metaphor for the human condition, illustrating Plato's theory of forms and his views on knowledge, education, and enlightenment. It is a striking and imaginative depiction of the struggle to attain true knowledge in a world that is dominated by illusion and ignorance. Through this allegory, Plato explores the nature of reality, the limits of human perception, and the transformative power of philosophical inquiry. The allegory begins with a group of prisoners who have been chained inside a dark cave for their entire lives. The prisoners are bound in such a way that they can only see the wall in front of them, and they are unable to turn their heads to see anything else. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway where other people pass, carrying objects of various shapes and sizes. The objects cast shadows on the wall in front of the prisoners, and because the prisoners have never seen anything else, they mistake these shadows for reality. To them, the shadows are the only world they know. They hear echoes and see shapes, and they take these as the only truth that exists. The shadows on the wall represent the world of appearances, the physical world that we experience through our senses. Plato believed that most people live their lives in a state of ignorance, mistaking the fleeting, imperfect objects of the material world for reality. Just as the prisoners in the cave are unaware of the true nature of the objects casting the shadows, most people are unaware of the higher, abstract realities, the forms that exist beyond the world of appearances. The cave symbolizes the limitations of human perception and the difficulty of attaining true knowledge in a world that is dominated by illusion and superficiality. In the next stage of the allegory, one of the prisoners is freed from his chains. At first, he is blinded by the light of the fire, and the new reality is disorienting. He is reluctant to believe that the shadows he had once accepted as reality were mere illusions. However, as his eyes adjust, he begins to see the objects that are casting the shadows, and he realizes that these objects are more real than the shadows on the wall. The freed prisoner represents the philosopher, the person who, through reason and intellectual inquiry, begins to see beyond the superficial appearances of the material world and grasps the true nature of reality. This process is not easy, as the philosopher must undergo a painful and difficult transformation, leaving behind the familiar world of appearances and venturing into the unknown. The allegory continues as the freed prisoner ascends out of the cave and into the world outside. As he emerges from the cave, he is again blinded by the light of the sun, which represents the ultimate truth, the form of the good. At first, he can only see shadows and reflections of objects in the sunlight, but gradually he comes to see the world in its full clarity. He sees the sun itself, which illuminates everything and makes vision possible. In Plato's metaphysics, the sun represents the form of the good, the highest and most important of all the forms. The good is the source of all knowledge and reality, and it is by understanding the good that one can truly grasp the nature of the universe and live a just and virtuous life. The journey of the freed prisoner is a metaphor for the process of philosophical enlightenment. The philosopher begins in ignorance, like the prisoners in the cave, but through education and the use of reason, he comes to understand the higher truths that exist beyond the physical world. The philosopher's task is not just to escape the cave for his own sake, but to return to the cave and help others see the truth. In the Republic, Plato argues that those who have attained knowledge of the forms, particularly the form of the good, have a moral duty to govern society and lead others out of ignorance. This idea is the foundation of Plato's concept of the philosopher king, a ruler who is guided by wisdom and the pursuit of justice, rather than by personal ambition or the desires of the masses. The allegory of the cave also illustrates the difficulty and danger of philosophical inquiry. When the freed prisoner returns to the cave to share his newfound knowledge with the other prisoners, they do not believe him. In fact, they ridicule him and resist his attempts to enlighten them. They are so attached to the shadows that they cannot comprehend the possibility of a higher reality. Plato uses this part of the allegory to illustrate the resistance that philosophers often face when trying to challenge established beliefs and conventional wisdom. Most people are content to live in ignorance, and they are often hostile to those who attempt to disrupt their comfortable illusions. This aspect of the allegory reflects Plato's own experiences with the trial and execution of Socrates, who was condemned for questioning the moral and political foundations of Athenian society. The allegory of the cave is not just a story about the pursuit of knowledge. It is also a reflection on the nature of education and the role of the philosopher in society. For Plato, true education is not about filling the mind with information, but about turning the soul toward the light of truth. The philosopher's task is to guide others on this journey, helping them to move from ignorance to knowledge, from the world of appearances to the world of reality. This process of education is transformative, and it requires not just intellectual effort, but a moral and spiritual awakening. Plato's allegory also has profound ethical implications. In his view, the philosopher, by virtue of his knowledge of the good, is uniquely qualified to lead society and to make decisions that promote justice and the common good. The philosopher king, who has ascended out of the cave and seen the true nature of reality, is the ideal ruler because he is not motivated by personal gain or the pursuit of power. Instead, he is guided by a deep understanding of what is good and just, and he seeks to apply this knowledge to the governance of the state. In the Republic, Plato contrasts the philosopher king with a tyrant, who is driven by base desires and lacks the wisdom to govern justly. The allegory thus serves as a powerful critique of political systems that are based on ignorance and self-interest, rather than on wisdom and justice. In a broader sense, the allegory of the cave speaks to the human condition and the challenges of seeking truth in a world that is often resistant to it. Plato's depiction of the prisoners, chained and unable to see beyond the shadows, is a powerful metaphor for the limitations of human perception and the difficulty of breaking free from the illusions that surround us. The allegory suggests that most people are content to live in a world of appearances, unaware of the deeper realities that lie beyond their immediate experience. The philosopher, by contrast, is someone who is willing to question these appearances and to seek out the truth, no matter how difficult or painful the journey may be. Plato's allegory has resonated with generations of thinkers, and it continues to be a central metaphor in discussions of philosophy, education, and politics. The image of the cave, with its shadows and illusions, has been used to illustrate the challenges of human knowledge and the difficulty of discerning truth from falsehood. The allegory has also been interpreted in a variety of ways, from a critique of political power and authority to a reflection on the nature of human consciousness and the limits of perception. One of the key themes of the allegory of the cave is the distinction between appearance and reality, a theme that runs throughout Plato's philosophy. In Plato's view, the physical world is a world of appearances, where everything is in a constant state of change and decay. True reality, by contrast, is unchanging and eternal, and it can only be understood through the intellect, rather than through the senses. The philosopher, by turning away from the world of appearances and focusing on the world of forms, is able to grasp the true nature of reality and attain knowledge of the good. This distinction between appearance and reality has been a central concern of Western philosophy, and it has influenced countless thinkers, from Descartes to Kant to contemporary philosophers. The allegory of the cave also raises important questions about the nature of authority and leadership. Plato's vision of the philosopher king suggests that those who possess knowledge of the truth are best suited to govern society, but this raises the question of how such individuals can attain power in a world that is dominated by ignorance and self-interest. The allegory highlights the tension between the pursuit of truth and the demands of political life, a tension that has been a central theme in political philosophy since Plato's time. In the end, the allegory of the cave is a powerful and enduring metaphor for the human condition, one that challenges us to reflect on the nature of reality, knowledge, and education. It is a reminder that the pursuit of truth is not easy, and that those who seek to enlighten others may face resistance and hostility. But it is also a reminder that true knowledge is possible, and that the journey from ignorance to understanding is one of the most important and transformative experiences we can undertake. Through this allegory, Plato invites us to break free from the chains of illusion and to seek out the higher truths that lie beyond the world of appearances. Part 8. The Ideal State. Plato's Republic, one of his most influential works, presents his vision of an ideal state, governed by justice, wisdom, and reason. His ideal state is rooted in his belief that most people are ill-equipped to make decisions about the governance of society because they are ruled by desires, emotions, and ignorance rather than by rational understanding. As a result, Plato was deeply skeptical of Athenian democracy, especially after witnessing the unjust trial and execution of his mentor, Socrates. In contrast to democratic rule, Plato proposed a political system where the most knowledgeable and virtuous individuals, philosopher kings, would hold power, ensuring that decisions are guided by wisdom and the pursuit of the common good, rather than by personal interests or the whims of the masses. At the heart of Plato's ideal state is the concept of justice, which he sought to define throughout the Republic. For Plato, justice in the state mirrors justice in the individual. Just as a just individual soul is ruled by reason, with the appetites and emotions kept in check, a just state is governed by those who possess the greatest wisdom and rational insight. In his model, Plato divides society into three distinct classes, each corresponding to a different part of the soul and fulfilling a specific role within the state. These classes are the ruling class, philosopher kings, the auxiliaries, soldiers, and the producers, farmers, artisans, and merchants. The philosopher kings, the highest class in Plato's ideal state, represent the rational part of the soul. These individuals are trained from a young age in the pursuit of knowledge and the understanding of the forms, particularly the form of the good. They possess the intellectual capacity and moral virtue required to rule justly, as they are motivated not by personal gain but by the desire to promote the welfare of the entire state. Plato believed that only those who have attained knowledge of the eternal and unchanging truths of the forms are capable of making decisions that are in the best interest of all citizens. The philosopher kings are, therefore, the embodiment of reason and wisdom, and their rule ensures that the state is governed by the principles of justice and the common good. The second class in Plato's ideal state is the auxiliaries, who correspond to the spirited part of the soul. These are the soldiers and guardians of the state, responsible for maintaining order, defending the city from external threats, and enforcing the laws established by the philosopher kings. The auxiliaries must possess the qualities of courage, discipline, and loyalty to the state, but unlike the philosopher kings, they do not possess the same level of philosophical wisdom. However, they are trained to recognize and respect the authority of the philosopher kings, understanding that their role is to support the rulers in the administration of justice and the protection of the state. In this way, the auxiliaries ensure that the state remains stable and secure, allowing the philosopher kings to focus on governing wisely. The third and largest class in Plato's ideal state is the producers, who correspond to the appetitive part of the soul. The producers are responsible for the economic needs of the state, including agriculture, craftsmanship, and commerce. Unlike the philosopher kings and the auxiliaries, the producers are not primarily concerned with the pursuit of wisdom or the defense of the state. Instead, their focus is on satisfying the material needs of society. However, Plato emphasized that even though the producers are driven by appetites and desires, their role in the state is essential, as they provide the resources and services necessary for the survival and well-being of all citizens. The key to a just state, according to Plato, is that each class performs its assigned function in harmony with the others, ensuring that the state operates efficiently and justly. Plato's ideal state is based on the principle of specialization, which means that each class must focus on its own specific role and refrain from interfering with the functions of the other classes. For example, the producers should not try to govern the state, just as the philosopher kings should not engage in economic activities. In this way, Plato argued, each class could contribute to the greater good of society by doing what it is best suited for. This principle of specialization reflects Plato's broader philosophical view that justice is achieved when each part of the whole performs its proper function in accordance with its nature. Just as the soul is just when reason governs and keeps the appetites in check, the state is just when the philosopher kings govern, the auxiliaries protect, and the producers provide. Plato's emphasis on the role of the philosopher kings reflects his belief that wisdom and knowledge are the most important qualities in a ruler. In the Republic, Plato argues that most people are driven by their desires and are easily swayed by emotions, making them unfit to govern. This critique of democracy, which he saw as a system in which power was given to the ignorant masses, led him to propose a political system where power would be concentrated in the hands of those who possess true knowledge. The philosopher kings, having studied the forms and gained insight into the nature of justice and the good, are uniquely qualified to make decisions that benefit the entire state, rather than serving their own interests or the desires of a particular faction. To ensure that the philosopher kings are prepared for their role, Plato proposed a rigorous system of education that would begin in childhood and continue throughout their lives. This education would include physical training, music, mathematics, and philosophy, all designed to cultivate the mind and body and prepare the philosopher kings to govern wisely. The final stage of their education would focus on dialectic, the process of philosophical reasoning and dialogue that leads to the discovery of truth. Only those who have successfully completed this extensive education and demonstrated their capacity for reason and virtue would be eligible to become philosopher kings. In this way, Plato sought to create a ruling class that was not only knowledgeable but also morally virtuous and dedicated to the common good. One of the more controversial aspects of Plato's ideal state is his proposal for the communal ownership of property and the abolition of the family among the ruling class. Plato argued that private property and family ties create conflicts of interest and encourage selfishness, which would undermine the ability of the philosopher kings to govern impartially. By eliminating these sources of division, Plato believed that the ruling class would be free to focus entirely on the welfare of the state, rather than on their personal interests. The philosopher kings and the auxiliaries, according to Plato's vision, would live communally, sharing their resources and responsibilities, while the producers would be allowed to own private property and form families. This radical proposal reflects Plato's belief that the interests of the state must take precedence over individual desires, particularly for those in positions of power. Plato's ideal state, as outlined in the Republic, is not only a vision of political justice, but also a reflection of his broader metaphysical and ethical views. The philosopher kings, as the rulers of the state, represent the triumph of reason over desire and emotion, and the state itself mirrors the harmony that exists in the soul when reason governs. In this way, Plato's ideal state is not just a political model but a moral ideal, a society where justice prevails because it is ruled by those who understand the true nature of justice and the good. However, Plato's ideal state has been the subject of much criticism, both in his time and in the centuries since. Critics have argued that his vision of a society ruled by philosopher kings is undemocratic and elitist, as it concentrates power in the hands of a small, unelected group of intellectuals. Others have pointed out that Plato's rigid division of society into classes seems overly hierarchical and does not allow for social mobility or the possibility that individuals from the lower classes could possess the wisdom needed to govern. Moreover, Plato's rejection of private property and the family for the ruling class has been seen as a violation of personal freedom and a denial of basic human desires. Despite these criticisms, Plato's vision of the ideal state has had a profound influence on political philosophy and continues to be a topic of debate and discussion. His emphasis on the role of wisdom and virtue in governance has inspired thinkers from antiquity to the present day, and his critique of democracy remains relevant in modern discussions about the role of expertise and knowledge in political decision-making. Plato's ideal state, though never realized in practice, serves as a powerful philosophical model for thinking about the relationship between justice, governance, and the good life. In addition to its political implications, Plato's vision of the ideal state raises important ethical questions about the nature of justice and the role of the individual in society. For Plato, justice is not simply a matter of individual rights or freedoms, but a question of how best to organize society so that each person can fulfill their proper role in accordance with their nature. This idea challenges modern notions of justice, which often focus on individual autonomy and equality, and it invites us to consider whether true justice can be achieved without a more collective understanding of the common good. Ultimately, Plato's ideal state is a reflection of his belief that the pursuit of truth and wisdom is the highest goal of human life. By creating a society where the most knowledgeable and virtuous individuals rule, Plato sought to ensure that justice would prevail and that all citizens would have the opportunity to live a good and fulfilling life. Though his vision may seem utopian or even unrealistic to some, it continues to inspire debates about the nature of justice, the role of education, and the responsibilities of those in positions of power. Part 9. Critique of Democracy. Plato's disillusionment with Athenian democracy played a significant role in shaping his political philosophy and his vision of the ideal state. His critique of democracy is one of the central themes in the Republic, where he systematically examines the shortcomings of this form of government and offers an alternative in the form of the philosopher king. Plato's personal experiences with the political turmoil of Athens, especially the trial and execution of Socrates, had a profound impact on his views. He saw democracy not as the embodiment of freedom and equality, but as a deeply flawed system that allowed unqualified and often self-serving individuals to hold power. For Plato, democracy represented a dangerous form of government that led to chaos, instability, and ultimately, tyranny. Plato's critique of democracy begins with his fundamental belief that most people are not equipped to make wise and informed decisions about the governance of society. In a democracy, power is given to the majority, who often lack the necessary knowledge, experience, and rational insight to govern justly. Plato argued that democracy is based on the assumption that all people are equally capable of ruling, which he believed was a dangerous fallacy. In the Republic, he likens democracy to a ship where the captain is elected by the crew, despite having no knowledge of navigation. Just as such a ship would quickly run aground or be lost at sea, a state governed by the ignorant masses would inevitably descend into disorder and corruption. For Plato, the central flaw of democracy is that it prioritizes freedom over order and wisdom. In a democratic state, individuals are free to pursue their own desires and interests without regard for the common good. This unchecked freedom, according to Plato, leads to a breakdown of social and political order, as people become more concerned with satisfying their appetites than with upholding justice. Democracy, in Plato's view, is driven by the whims of the masses, who are easily swayed by demagogues, charismatic leaders who appeal to popular emotions and desires rather than reason and virtue. These demagogues manipulate public opinion to gain power, promising to fulfill the desires of the people while pursuing their own self-interests. Plato believed that such leaders would ultimately exploit the weaknesses of democracy to establish tyranny, as the unchecked freedom of democracy leads to a desire for stronger, more authoritarian rule when chaos inevitably ensues. Plato's concerns about the dangers of democracy were rooted in his experiences with the political instability of Athens in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War. The defeat of Athens by Sparta in 404 BCE had led to the brief but brutal rule of the 30 tyrants, an oligarchic regime that carried out a violent purge of democratic leaders and dissenters. Although the oligarchy was overthrown and democracy restored, the political climate in Athens remained volatile and divided. The execution of Socrates in 399 BCE, carried out by a democratic court, was a turning point for Plato. He saw it as a clear example of how democracy, far from promoting justice, could be manipulated by the passions and prejudices of the majority to persecute those who challenged the status quo. In the Republic, Plato describes the decline of political systems in a progression that begins with aristocracy and ends in tyranny. He outlines 5 types of government: aristocracy, timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. Aristocracy, the rule of the best, is the ideal form of government, where the philosopher kings govern based on wisdom and justice. Timocracy, which prioritizes honor and military prowess, is the next best system but is inferior to aristocracy because it is driven by ambition rather than pure reason. Oligarchy, the rule of the wealthy few, emerges when the pursuit of wealth overtakes the pursuit of honor, leading to a government that serves the interests of the rich at the expense of the poor. Democracy arises when the people revolt against the injustices of oligarchy, demanding equality and freedom. However, Plato argues that democracy, with its emphasis on freedom and individual rights, inevitably leads to chaos, as people prioritize their personal desires over the needs of the community. This chaos sets the stage for tyranny, as the people eventually seek out a strong leader to restore order, resulting in the rise of a tyrant who consolidates power and rules through fear and oppression. Plato's critique of democracy is not merely a rejection of the system as it existed in Athens, but a broader commentary on human nature and the difficulties of governing a just society. He believed that most people are ruled by their appetites and desires, rather than by reason and virtue. In a democratic society, where power is distributed equally among all citizens, these base desires are given free rein, leading to a breakdown of moral and social order. Without the guidance of wise and virtuous rulers, Plato argued, democracy would always devolve into tyranny, as the people would eventually turn to a demagogue who promises to fulfill their desires while secretly pursuing his own path to absolute power. Plato also believed that democracy promotes a false sense of equality. While it may seem that democracy gives all citizens an equal voice in the government, Plato argued that this equality is superficial and ignores the fundamental differences in individuals' abilities and virtues. In the Republic, Plato emphasizes the importance of specialization, arguing that just as individuals are suited for different roles in society based on their natural abilities, not everyone is suited to rule. The idea that anyone can govern, regardless of their wisdom or knowledge, was, for Plato, one of the most dangerous aspects of democracy. He believed that true justice could only be achieved when power was in the hands of those who were best equipped to wield it, namely, the philosopher kings who had been trained in the pursuit of truth and the understanding of the good. One of Plato's key criticisms of democracy is that it fosters a culture of excessive individualism and self-interest. In a democratic society, people are free to pursue their own goals and desires without regard for the common good. This freedom, while appealing on the surface, leads to a lack of discipline and self-control, as individuals become more focused on their personal pleasures than on their responsibilities to society. Plato saw this unchecked freedom as a recipe for disaster, as it undermined the social cohesion and moral values that are necessary for a just and stable society. In the Republic, he describes democracy as a system where citizens live like the many-colored cloak, meaning that it is a society filled with variety and diversity, but lacking in unity and purpose. This focus on individual freedom ultimately leads to a state of anarchy, where everyone does as they please, and no one is concerned with the well-being of the community as a whole. For Plato, the solution to the problems of democracy lies in the establishment of a just and rational government, led by philosopher kings. These rulers, having attained knowledge of the forms and the good, are capable of making decisions that promote the welfare of all citizens, rather than serving the interests of a particular class or faction. Unlike democratic leaders, who are swayed by public opinion and personal ambition, the philosopher kings are motivated by a deep commitment to justice and the common good. Plato's ideal state, as outlined in the Republic, is one where each individual performs the role for which they are best suited, and where power is concentrated in the hands of those who are best equipped to govern wisely and justly. Plato's critique of democracy has been influential throughout the history of political thought, inspiring both supporters and detractors. Some have praised Plato for his insight into the dangers of demagoguery and the instability of democratic systems, while others have criticized him for his elitism and his apparent rejection of political equality. Plato's vision of the philosopher king, while appealing in theory, has been criticized as impractical and undemocratic, as it places power in the hands of an unelected few and assumes that philosophers, by virtue of their wisdom, are immune to the corrupting influence of power. Despite these criticisms, Plato's concerns about the dangers of democracy remain relevant in contemporary political discussions. His warnings about the rise of demagogues, the manipulation of public opinion, and the challenges of maintaining order and justice in a democratic society continue to resonate today. In modern democracies, the balance between individual freedom and the common good is still a central issue, and the question of how to ensure that those in power are motivated by wisdom and virtue, rather than by personal ambition, remains a pressing concern. Plato's critique of democracy also invites us to reflect on the nature of political authority and the responsibilities of citizens in a democratic society. While democracy offers the promise of freedom and equality, it also places a heavy burden on citizens to engage in thoughtful and informed decision-making. Plato's emphasis on the importance of education and the pursuit of wisdom suggests that a successful democracy depends not only on the structure of government, but also on the moral and intellectual development of its citizens. In this sense, Plato's critique of democracy is not just a rejection of the system, but a call for deeper reflection on how we can create a more just and enlightened society. Ultimately, Plato's critique of democracy challenges us to think critically about the nature of political power, the role of wisdom in governance, and the relationship between freedom and justice. While his vision of the philosopher king may seem distant from the realities of modern politics, his concerns about the dangers of unchecked freedom, the influence of demagogues, and the need for wise and virtuous leadership continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about the future of democracy. Part 10. Plato's Dialogues. Plato's body of work is vast and diverse, but the majority of his philosophical writings take the form of dialogues, a distinctive literary format in which characters engage in lively discussions, often centered around a central philosophical question. These dialogues are not merely records of Socratic conversations, but are rich, layered texts that reflect Plato's evolving thought and his exploration of a wide range of topics, from ethics and politics to metaphysics and epistemology. The dialogues were Plato's way of presenting philosophical arguments in a manner that was engaging and accessible, while also encouraging readers to engage in their own critical thinking. Through these dialogues, Plato captured the essence of philosophical inquiry as a dynamic process, one that involved questioning, debate, and the gradual uncovering of truth. One of the defining features of Plato's dialogues is the presence of Socrates as the main character and interlocutor. Although Socrates never wrote down his teachings, Plato immortalized his mentor by placing him at the center of many dialogues. In these works, Socrates serves as a mouthpiece for Plato's ideas, using the Socratic method of questioning to probe the beliefs and assumptions of others. The dialogues often start with Socrates asking a seemingly simple question, such as, "What is justice?" or "What is virtue?" and then proceed through a series of responses and refutations as Socrates exposes the contradictions and gaps in the interlocutor's arguments. This method, known as elenchus, was a hallmark of Socratic philosophy and became a key tool for Plato in his philosophical explorations. The structure of the dialogues reflects Plato's belief that philosophy is not about delivering definitive answers or dogmatic truths, but about engaging in an ongoing process of inquiry. Plato deliberately avoids giving conclusive answers in many of his dialogues, instead leaving the reader with more questions than when the conversation began. This open-ended approach is central to the dialogue's purpose, to provoke thought and encourage readers to reflect on their own assumptions and beliefs. For Plato, the true value of philosophy lies not in the possession of knowledge, but in the continuous search for understanding. The Republic is perhaps the most famous of Plato's dialogues, and it exemplifies many of the features of his philosophical style. The dialogue is set in the form of a conversation between Socrates and several other characters, including Glaucon and Adimantus, as they explore the nature of justice and the ideal state. Through the dialogue, Plato presents his theory of forms, the allegory of the cave, and his vision of the philosopher king, among other important ideas. The Republic is notable for its breadth and depth, covering topics as diverse as ethics, politics, education, and metaphysics, while always returning to the central question of what it means to live a just and virtuous life. The dialogue's complexity and richness have made it one of the most studied and discussed texts in Western philosophy. Another important dialogue is the Phaedo, which deals with the nature of the soul and the question of immortality. Set on the day of Socrates' execution, the Phaedo depicts a conversation between Socrates and his followers as they discuss the fate of the soul after death. Socrates presents several arguments for the immortality of the soul, including the idea that the soul is eternal and unchanging, like the forms. The dialogue is both a philosophical exploration of metaphysics and a moving reflection on death, as Socrates calmly prepares to drink the hemlock that will end his life. Through this dialogue, Plato explores profound questions about life, death, and the nature of the self, offering a vision of the philosopher as someone who seeks truth not only in life but also in the face of death. The Symposium is another of Plato's great dialogues, focused on the nature of love and beauty. The dialogue is set at a banquet where several guests, including Socrates, Aristophanes, and the playwright Agathon, take turns giving speeches about the nature of eros, or love. Each speaker offers a different perspective on love, ranging from physical desire to spiritual longing, but it is Socrates who delivers the most profound insights. Drawing on the teachings of the mysterious figure Diotima, Socrates presents love as a ladder of ascent, beginning with physical attraction to beautiful bodies and culminating in the contemplation of the form of beauty itself. For Plato, love is not just a physical or emotional experience, but a powerful force that drives the soul toward higher knowledge and the appreciation of the eternal and unchanging. The Symposium is both a celebration of love and a reflection on the philosophical nature of desire and the pursuit of truth. In the Meno, Plato explores the question of whether virtue can be taught. The dialogue begins with Meno asking Socrates, "Can virtue be taught?" and proceeds with Socrates questioning Meno's assumptions about the nature of virtue. Through their discussion, Socrates introduces the theory of recollection, the idea that all learning is a form of remembering knowledge that the soul possessed in a previous existence. This theory ties into Plato's broader metaphysical views about the immortality of the soul and the existence of the forms. The Meno is also notable for introducing the Socratic paradox, the idea that true knowledge is recognizing one's own ignorance. This paradox, which lies at the heart of Socratic philosophy, underscores the importance of humility and self-examination in the pursuit of wisdom. The Timaeus is one of Plato's more obscure and cosmological dialogues, offering a detailed account of the creation of the universe. In this dialogue, the character Timaeus presents a vision of the cosmos as a rational and ordered structure, created by a divine craftsman or demiurge. The dialogue explores Plato's views on the nature of the physical world, the role of mathematics in understanding the cosmos, and the relationship between the material and the eternal. The Timaeus is significant for its influence on later scientific and philosophical thought, particularly in its vision of a universe governed by rational principles and mathematical harmony. While the dialogue is less focused on ethics or politics than some of Plato's other works, it reflects his deep interest in the nature of reality and the origins of the world. One of Plato's later dialogues, The Laws, presents a more practical and detailed vision of political governance than the idealistic Republic. In The Laws, Plato acknowledges that the philosopher king may be an unattainable ideal and offers a more pragmatic approach to creating a just society. The dialogue is set as a conversation between an Athenian stranger and two other characters as they discuss the laws and institutions necessary for a well-ordered state. Unlike the Republic, which envisions a utopia ruled by philosophers, The Laws is more concerned with creating a system of governance that can realistically accommodate human weaknesses and imperfections. Plato's emphasis in this dialogue is on the importance of law as a guiding force in maintaining social order and justice. While The Laws is often seen as more conservative and less visionary than the Republic, it represents an important development in Plato's thinking about politics and governance. The dialogues are not only philosophical texts, but also works of literature. Plato's use of dialogue as a form allows him to create rich and complex characters, each with their own distinct voice and perspective. Through these characters, Plato is able to present multiple viewpoints on a given issue, encouraging the reader to engage with the arguments and think critically about the ideas being discussed. The dialogues are filled with dramatic tension, humor, and irony, making them engaging and thought-provoking to read. Socrates, as the central figure in many of these dialogues, serves as both a teacher and a provocateur, challenging his interlocutors to question their beliefs and pushing them toward deeper reflection. Plato's dialogues also reflect his belief in the importance of dialectic, or the process of dialogue and reasoned debate, as the highest form of philosophical inquiry. For Plato, philosophy is not a solitary pursuit but a social activity, one that takes place through conversation and the exchange of ideas. The dialogues are structured to encourage readers to engage in this process, inviting them to take part in the philosophical discussions and to challenge their own assumptions. This emphasis on dialogue and questioning reflects Plato's belief that truth is not something that can be handed down from a teacher to a student, but must be discovered through critical thinking and self-examination. While the content of Plato's dialogues covers a wide range of topics, from ethics and politics to metaphysics and cosmology, they are united by a common theme: the search for truth and the pursuit of wisdom. Plato's dialogues encourage readers to reflect on the most fundamental questions of human existence. What is justice? What is virtue? What is the nature of reality? How should we live our lives? These questions are as relevant today as they were in Plato's time, and the dialogues continue to inspire generations of philosophers, scholars, and students to engage in the ongoing pursuit of knowledge. The dialogues also serve as a testament to Plato's belief in the transformative power of philosophy. For Plato, philosophy is not just an intellectual exercise but a way of life, a practice that shapes how we think, act, and engage with the world. The dialogues illustrate this by showing how Socrates, through his questioning and reasoning, leads his interlocutors toward a deeper understanding of themselves and the world around them. In this sense, Plato's dialogues are not just philosophical texts but invitations to embark on the philosophical journey, to engage in the search for truth, and to live a life guided by reason and wisdom. In conclusion, Plato's dialogues are some of the most important and influential works in the history of Western philosophy. Through the dialogue form, Plato was able to explore a wide range of philosophical questions in a way that was both rigorous and accessible, encouraging readers to think critically and engage with the ideas presented. The dialogues are filled with rich characters, dramatic exchanges, and profound insights, making them not only essential philosophical texts but also enduring works of literature. Through these dialogues, Plato invites us to join him in the search for truth, to question our own assumptions, and to seek wisdom in a world filled with uncertainty. Part 11. Plato's influence on Aristotle. One of the most famous and significant intellectual relationships in history is that between Plato and his student, Aristotle. Aristotle arrived at Plato's academy as a young man around 367 BCE and remained there for approximately 20 years. During this time, Aristotle absorbed much of Plato's philosophy, yet he would later diverge from his teacher in profound ways, developing his own system of thought that would challenge and expand upon Plato's ideas. The philosophical lineage from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle laid the groundwork for much of Western thought, but it also demonstrates how philosophical traditions evolve, with each generation questioning and refining the ideas of the previous one. At the heart of the relationship between Plato and Aristotle was a shared interest in fundamental philosophical questions, such as the nature of reality, ethics, politics, and the human soul. Both philosophers were deeply concerned with understanding the world in a systematic and rational way. However, despite this common foundation, Aristotle came to disagree with many of Plato's central ideas, most notably the theory of forms. This disagreement between teacher and student highlights one of the most important themes in philosophy, the necessity of critical engagement and debate, even with the ideas of those we admire most. Plato's theory of forms posits that the material world is only a shadow or imitation of a higher, non-material realm where perfect and unchanging forms exist. For example, all physical horses are imperfect copies of the ideal form of a horse, and all acts of justice are imperfect reflections of the perfect form of justice. The forms, according to Plato, are the true reality, and the material world is merely a reflection of these eternal truths. Aristotle, however, found this metaphysical system problematic. He believed that Plato's distinction between the physical world and the world of forms created an unnecessary divide between reality and experience. For Aristotle, the forms did not exist in a separate realm, but were instead embedded in the things themselves. In other words, the essence of a horse or an act of justice could be found within the physical object or action, not in some distant, abstract realm. Aristotle argued that knowledge comes from studying the natural world directly, through observation and empirical investigation, rather than through contemplation of abstract forms. This rejection of Plato's theory of forms was one of Aristotle's most significant departures from his teacher, and it marks the beginning of a new approach to philosophy, one that emphasized the importance of empirical evidence and direct observation in understanding the world. Aristotle's focus on empirical observation is most evident in his work on biology and the natural sciences. While Plato was primarily concerned with metaphysical questions and the realm of abstract ideas, Aristotle devoted much of his work to the study of the natural world. He systematically observed and classified plants and animals, laying the groundwork for the scientific method. Aristotle's emphasis on studying the material world as it is, rather than seeking knowledge in a higher realm of forms, was a major shift in philosophical thinking, and it had a profound influence on the development of science. This approach also extended to Aristotle's views on ethics, politics, and metaphysics, where he consistently sought to ground his theories in the realities of human experience and the natural world. Despite their disagreements, Aristotle retained a deep respect for Plato and acknowledged the profound impact his teacher had on his intellectual development. In his work Metaphysics, Aristotle refers to Plato as the man whom I love and respect, before proceeding to critique his ideas. This shows the complex nature of their relationship, one that was marked by both admiration and philosophical divergence. While Aristotle challenged many of Plato's core ideas, he also built upon them, using Plato's work as a foundation for his own contributions to philosophy. For example, while Aristotle rejected the theory of forms, he developed his own concept of substance and form, where form is the principle that gives shape and purpose to matter. In this way, Aristotle adapted and transformed Plato's ideas to fit his own philosophical system. In the realm of ethics, Aristotle also took a different approach from Plato. While Plato's ethical theory was rooted in the idea that knowledge of the forms, particularly the form of the good, was the key to living a virtuous life, Aristotle developed a more practical and human-centered approach to ethics. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argued that virtue is not something that can be understood through abstract contemplation, but is instead a matter of practical wisdom and habituation. For Aristotle, living a virtuous life meant finding a balance between excess and deficiency in one's actions, a concept he referred to as the golden mean. Virtue, according to Aristotle, is developed through practice and experience, rather than through the intellectual pursuit of abstract truths. This emphasis on practical wisdom and the role of experience in ethical development was a significant departure from Plato's more idealistic and intellectualized approach to ethics. Aristotle's political philosophy also differs from Plato's in important ways. While Plato's vision of the ideal state, as described in the Republic, is based on the rule of philosopher kings and a rigid class structure, Aristotle took a more pragmatic approach to politics. In his work Politics, Aristotle argues that the best form of government is one that takes into account the specific circumstances and needs of a given society. He did not believe in a one-size-fits-all solution to political governance, and he was skeptical of Plato's idea of an ideal state ruled by philosophers. Instead, Aristotle believed that the best government is a mixed constitution that balances the interests of the rich and the poor, promoting stability and justice through moderation. This more practical and adaptable approach to politics reflects Aristotle's broader emphasis on empirical observation and his belief that political systems must be grounded in the realities of human nature and society. One area where Aristotle was particularly critical of Plato was in his rejection of Plato's communal vision for the ruling class. In the Republic, Plato proposed that the philosopher kings and the guardian class should live communally, without private property or families, in order to avoid conflicts of interest and ensure that their loyalty was solely to the state. Aristotle, however, believed that such a system was unrealistic and contrary to human nature. He argued that private property and family life are essential to human flourishing, and that communal living would undermine the stability and happiness of the ruling class. Aristotle believed that the pursuit of individual happiness and well-being was an essential part of living a virtuous life, and he saw Plato's rejection of private property and the family as an unnecessary and counterproductive limitation on personal freedom. Despite these disagreements, Aristotle's philosophy was deeply influenced by Plato in many respects. Aristotle's concept of telos, or purpose, is closely related to Plato's notion of the forms, in that both philosophers believed that everything in the world has a purpose or ideal form that it seeks to fulfill. For Aristotle, understanding the purpose of a thing was essential to understanding its nature, and this idea would become central to his metaphysics, ethics, and biology. In this way, Aristotle built upon Plato's ideas while transforming them into a more practical and empirically grounded system. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle is a testament to the dynamic nature of philosophical inquiry, where each generation builds on the insights of the previous one, refining and expanding ideas in response to new questions and challenges. Aristotle's influence extended far beyond his critique of Plato, as his own philosophical system would come to dominate much of Western thought for centuries. While Plato's ideas were highly influential during his lifetime and in the early centuries following his death, Aristotle's works became the foundation of medieval scholasticism and were central to the development of science, logic, and ethics in the Western world. Aristotle's method of inquiry, which emphasized empirical observation and logical reasoning, laid the groundwork for the scientific method, and his ethical and political theories continued to influence philosophers and political theorists throughout the Renaissance and Enlightenment. In the centuries following their deaths, both Plato and Aristotle would be regarded as the two towering figures of ancient Greek philosophy. Their intellectual rivalry, rooted in deep respect but marked by significant philosophical differences, shaped the course of Western philosophy and continues to influence debates on metaphysics, ethics, politics, and science. While Plato's idealism and emphasis on the eternal and unchanging nature of the forms resonated with later philosophers like Augustine and Kant, Aristotle's empirical approach and focus on the material world became the foundation for the natural sciences and the development of modern philosophy. The influence of Plato and Aristotle can be seen not only in the development of Western thought, but also in the ongoing philosophical debates that continue to this day. Their contrasting approaches to questions of reality, knowledge, and ethics provide two distinct paths for understanding the world: Plato's emphasis on abstract reasoning and the pursuit of eternal truths, and Aristotle's focus on empirical observation and the practical wisdom of living a virtuous life. These two traditions have shaped the intellectual landscape of the West and continue to inspire new generations of philosophers, scientists, and scholars. In conclusion, the relationship between Plato and Aristotle was one of the most fruitful and important in the history of philosophy. Aristotle's critique of Plato's ideas, particularly the theory of forms, led to the development of his own philosophical system, which emphasized empirical observation and practical wisdom. Despite their differences, the intellectual legacy of both philosophers continues to shape the way we think about the world and our place in it. Their contributions to metaphysics, ethics, politics, and science have had a lasting impact on Western thought, and their ideas remain central to the philosophical discussions of today. The philosophical dialogue between Plato and Aristotle is a reminder of the importance of questioning and refining even the most revered ideas, as each generation seeks to expand and deepen our understanding of the world. Part 12. Plato's Legacy. Plato's legacy is vast and continues to influence philosophy, politics, education, and many other areas of intellectual thought to this day. His work laid the foundations of Western philosophy and established ideas that would be explored, challenged, and reinterpreted by countless thinkers over the centuries. Plato's Academy, which he founded in 387 BCE, became the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, providing a model for future universities and centers of intellectual pursuit. But beyond the Academy and its immediate impact, Plato's writings, particularly his dialogues, have been a cornerstone of philosophical education and discourse for more than 2 millennia. One of the key aspects of Plato's enduring influence is his exploration of the nature of reality, knowledge, and ethics. His theory of forms, while debated and critiqued by subsequent philosophers, remains one of the most important and influential metaphysical theories in the history of philosophy. The idea that there is a higher, unchanging reality beyond the world of appearances has resonated through centuries of philosophical thought and has been interpreted in various ways by thinkers such as Plotinus, who founded Neoplatonism, and even modern philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who grappled with the relationship between the material world and the realm of abstract principles. Plato's emphasis on the eternal and the immutable, particularly through his theory of forms, influenced not just metaphysics but also ethical thought, as philosophers sought to understand how unchanging standards of justice and goodness could be applied to the ever-changing conditions of human life. In the centuries after Plato's death, his ideas became central to the development of both pagan and Christian thought. During the Hellenistic period, philosophers such as the Neoplatonists, including Plotinus and Proclus, expanded on Plato's metaphysical ideas, particularly his vision of the world of forms and the nature of the soul. Neoplatonism emphasized the spiritual ascent of the soul toward unity with the divine, a concept that had its roots in Plato's discussions of the immortal soul and its journey toward knowledge and truth. Neoplatonism would later have a profound influence on Christian theology, particularly through the writings of early Christian philosophers such as Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, deeply influenced by Plato and the Neoplatonists, integrated Platonic thought into his Christian theology, particularly Plato's ideas about the nature of the soul, the existence of an eternal realm beyond the material world, and the relationship between the individual and the divine. Through Augustine and other early Christian thinkers, Plato's philosophy became a major influence on medieval Christian thought, shaping the development of Christian metaphysics and ethics. Many of Plato's ideas about the soul's immortality, the nature of truth, and the role of reason in understanding the divine were adapted and incorporated into Christian doctrine. For instance, Augustine's City of God reflects a Platonic vision of a higher, divine realm that exists beyond the material world, mirroring Plato's belief in the existence of a perfect, eternal realm of forms. This blending of Platonic and Christian ideas was not without tension, but it demonstrates the flexibility and adaptability of Plato's thought in addressing some of the most pressing metaphysical and ethical questions of both the ancient and medieval worlds. Plato's influence on education is equally profound. His belief that education is not simply about imparting knowledge, but about shaping the soul and guiding individuals toward virtue became a guiding principle in the development of educational systems throughout history. In the Republic, Plato outlines a rigorous system of education for the philosopher kings, emphasizing the importance of physical training, music, mathematics, and dialectical reasoning. This holistic approach to education, one that develops both the mind and the body, as well as the moral character, has influenced educational models from ancient Greece to modern times. The idea that education should be aimed at developing virtuous citizens, capable of contributing to the common good, is a theme that runs through much of Western educational thought, from the classical academies to modern liberal arts institutions. Plato's vision of the philosopher as a seeker of truth and wisdom also had a profound impact on the development of intellectual traditions in both the East and West. The Platonic ideal of the philosopher as someone who seeks to understand the deeper truths of existence through reason, contemplation, and dialogue inspired generations of scholars and thinkers. In the Islamic world, for example, many of Plato's works were translated and studied by Muslim philosophers such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna, who integrated Platonic thought into their own explorations of metaphysics and ethics. Plato's emphasis on the pursuit of truth and the role of reason in understanding the divine resonated deeply with Islamic philosophy, which, like Neoplatonism, sought to reconcile rational inquiry with spiritual knowledge. The Renaissance saw a revival of Platonic thought, particularly through the work of figures like Marsilio Ficino, who translated many of Plato's works into Latin and helped reintroduce Platonic philosophy to Western Europe. Ficino's work, along with that of other Renaissance humanists, helped spark a renewed interest in Platonic ideas, particularly the relationship between beauty, truth, and goodness. The Platonic emphasis on the contemplation of higher realities and the pursuit of intellectual and moral virtue became central to Renaissance humanism, influencing art, literature, and philosophy. The rediscovery of Plato's dialogues during this period reinvigorated discussions of ethics, politics, and metaphysics, shaping the intellectual currents that would lead to the Enlightenment. In modern philosophy, Plato's influence can be seen in the work of thinkers like Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Alfred North Whitehead. Kant, in particular, was deeply influenced by Plato's distinction between the world of appearances and the world of things in themselves. Kant's critique of pure reason echoes many of Plato's concerns about the limits of human perception and the nature of true knowledge, as Kant sought to explore how the mind structures our experience of the world. Plato's ideas about the nature of reality and the pursuit of truth thus continue to resonate in modern philosophical discussions, particularly in areas of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Friedrich Nietzsche, while critical of Plato, also engaged deeply with Platonic thought. Nietzsche famously referred to Western philosophy as Platonism for the people, reflecting his belief that much of Western thought, particularly Christian morality, was deeply influenced by Plato's distinction between the material world and a higher, more perfect realm. Nietzsche rejected Plato's emphasis on the transcendent and the eternal, advocating instead for a philosophy that embraced life in the material world, with all its imperfections and struggles. Despite this rejection, Nietzsche's critique of Plato highlights the central role that Platonic thought has played in shaping the philosophical landscape of the West. Plato's legacy in political thought is equally enduring. His critique of democracy, as well as his vision of the ideal state ruled by philosopher kings, continues to inspire debate among political theorists. While many modern thinkers reject Plato's authoritarian model of government, his analysis of the flaws of democracy, particularly the dangers of demagoguery and the rule of the uninformed, remains relevant in contemporary political discussions. Plato's exploration of justice in the Republic, where he argues that a just society is one in which each individual fulfills their proper role, continues to influence discussions about the nature of justice and the organization of society. His ideas about the importance of virtue and wisdom in governance also resonate with modern debates about the role of expertise and moral integrity in leadership. Plato's influence on the development of philosophical method is perhaps his most lasting legacy. The use of dialogue as a tool for philosophical inquiry, the emphasis on dialectical reasoning, and the belief that philosophy is a process of continuous questioning and self-examination have become central to the philosophical tradition. Plato's dialogues, with their use of Socratic questioning and exploration of multiple perspectives, have shaped the way philosophy is taught and practiced. The idea that philosophy is not about finding definitive answers, but about engaging in a process of critical reflection and dialogue remains a foundational principle of philosophical inquiry today. In addition to his influence on philosophy, Plato's ideas have had a profound impact on literature, art, and culture. His vision of the ideal, the perfect, and the eternal has inspired countless works of art, literature, and music, particularly in the realms of beauty and aesthetics. Plato's exploration of the relationship between beauty and truth in works like the Symposium and Phaedrus has influenced generations of artists and writers who seek to capture the ideal forms of beauty in their work. His dialogues, with their dramatic tension and rich characterizations, are also considered works of literature in their own right, inspiring generations of writers to explore philosophical themes in their narratives. Plato's legacy, in short, is one of profound and far-reaching influence. His ideas about reality, knowledge, ethics, politics, and education continue to shape intellectual discourse across disciplines. From the founding of the Academy to the present day, Plato's thought has remained central to the Western intellectual tradition, inspiring philosophers, scientists, artists, and educators to engage in the search for truth and wisdom. His dialogues, filled with questions that remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Athens, challenge us to think critically about the nature of reality, the role of the individual in society, and the pursuit of the good life. Plato's enduring influence is a testament to the power of philosophy to transform how we understand ourselves and the world around us. As we reflect on Plato's legacy, we are reminded of his belief that philosophy is not just a theoretical discipline but a way of life, a practice that requires us to question our assumptions, seek truth, and strive for wisdom in all aspects of life. This vision of philosophy as a transformative journey, one that leads us from the shadows of ignorance to the light of knowledge, remains as compelling today as it was over 2,000 years ago. Through his dialogues and his ideas, Plato continues to invite us to join him in this journey, guiding us toward a deeper understanding of the world and our place within it.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through the life and ideas of Plato. We hope you gained a deeper understanding of his profound impact on philosophy and Western thought. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content. Stay curious and keep exploring the world of ideas.